I'm John Moscow.
And I'm Amy Halpern-Laff. Welcome to Ethical Schools.
Our guest today is Maud Abeel. Maud's an educational consultant both in New York City and nationally, working across the continuum from zero to the post-secondary years. She's especially focused on college and career readiness for middle and high school students. Previously, among other positions, she was the Senior Director for College and Career Readiness at the Urban Assembly, Associate Director of Strategic Partnerships for National Post-Secondary Success Initiatives at FHI 360, and Director of College Bound at New Visions for Public Schools. She helped to write and edit Turning Points 2000, Educating Adolescents in the 21st Century, and was a Senior Program Officer for Middle Start, FHI 360's model for ensuring academic success and healthy development for middle grade students. Welcome, Maud.
Hi, thank you for having me.
You've been an advocate of the fit and match idea in advising high school students about colleges. What is fit and match, and why is it so important?
Well, again, thank you for having me. It's great to be talking with you both. Often match and fit are used interchangeably, but I do think it's helpful to differentiate between the two. And I thought that the National College Access Network, NCAN, provided a definition that I found helpful, so I'll share that, which is basically that match is the degree to which a student's academic credentials match the academic competitiveness and selectivity of the college or university or post-secondary institution at which they want to enroll. So it's very objective. You either have the academic credentials that the school requires or you don't. But then there's fit, and fit is sort of, on the other hand, literally everything else. So it can include distance from a student's home, geographic location, campus atmosphere and degree of inclusivity, level of accommodation of and services for first-generation students, academic programs, so, and on and on. So this is a very expansive view of what fit is, and it makes it hard to capture and codify, but it's, that doesn't diminish its importance. For example, whether social-emotional cultural fit can be quantified or sort of pinned down is one example of this challenge. And why I think it's so important is that we know that increasingly students are going to college in the United States, but there really hasn't been any dramatic corresponding increase in college completion or degree attainment. And we know that's particularly true for low-income students of color. And there's basically sort of three prominent barriers to completion. The first is pretty well known as academic. Second is financial, but the third is sort of a sense of belonging. And many students, and I was recently involved in a project where we were able to do some focus groups with students, they worry and wonder whether they belong in college. It's not just assumed that they should go to college for them. And so for many students, the sense of uncertainty exacerbates the challenges that they face as they prepare for or think about college. And I think match and fit helps to send an overall message that all students are entitled to a successful post-secondary experience, and that there is a good match and fit for every student, no matter where they're starting.
So, as you're saying, fit is much more subjective than match. How should or can counselors define this in a systematic way? And how can it be brought to scale beyond the individual counselor?
So the good news is that there really are a lot of excellent online resources that counselors can use with students. There are a number that are free. And so, for example, in New York City, every single public high school student has a College Board account. It's a requirement. It gives them access to PSAT and SAT pre-prep and other kinds of free things that are helpful to them. And it also provides something called Create Your Roadmap. And so it's a way for students to, they can either, it's actually interesting, I was looking at it today, and they have some choices for students, and one of them is, I know what I want. And that leads the student in a certain direction on the website. And then there's another choice, I'm not sure where to start. And so it's really trying to help students wherever they're at. And part of the process is getting to know yourself, kinds of thinking around what you enjoy doing, what don't you like doing, but ultimately leading students to create a step-by-step plan that they can save as part of their account. So that's a free one. There's also one called My College Matches. And I thought that was an interesting one because it really puts an emphasis on helping students look specifically at majors that different colleges and institutions offer and how they tie to career paths. Then there's a whole bunch that cost money. And one of the reasons they cost money is because they have sort of a higher level of sophistication. They're very student friendly. They're very intuitive. They're much more playful in some ways, the way students can enter and use them. But one that's gotten a lot of attention recently in New York City is called Zello. Kind of has a process where it helps students build self-knowledge, then explore options, then create a plan, and then learn and reassess. And it's really ideally meant to start with a student, by 8th or 9th grade, and it follows them throughout their time in high school. So these online resources offer sort of very systematic approaches to getting students to really understand what match and fit might mean for them. Otherwise, I think, to make it more systematic is really just the goal would be to start as early as possible, in the high school, ideally in 9th grade through age-appropriate activities. So in a lot of schools, they use advisory, and that can often mean actually using a curriculum that advisors lead students through. An example of one that I've gotten to know recently is one of my consulting clients, Jobs for the Future, is they have a curriculum that's intended to use an advisory after school called Possible Futures, and that helps students understand and learn sort of skills for success, like teamwork and communication. And then they also have another one that gives students opportunities to sort of explore lenses on the future. But I just think these age-appropriate approaches and activities to help students sort of develop self-knowledge and thoughts about the future, it can really help students get more out of their secondary school years. Students are bored or that school feels irrelevant, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so that's another sort of rationale for helping students to sort of see where they fit into this educational journey that they're on, and hopefully help them sort of make more sense of why it matters and why it should be important to them.
The National College Access Network talks about the tension that can exist between what a counselor thinks is the best fit and match and what the student and or their families think is best. Have you seen counselors have to resolve this tension, and what seems to you to be the best way to do it?
Well, I think this is a huge, huge part of the job in terms of having to acknowledge and deal with this kind of tension. So, even match is not completely straightforward because there's an increasing number of test optional schools and schools that de-emphasize standardized tests. So in theory, that's sort of opening up a lot of options for students that didn't exist before, and sort of makes the match piece a little less clear cut. So I think, trust is just, it's a huge, huge factor. And ideally, a counselor is able to build trust with both students and their families. Obviously, families are really important for the equation all throughout a child's educational journey, and especially in some ways at this moment. Some ways that a school can do that is have very predictable series of annual events targeted at each grade level. In 9th grade, having a 9th grade orientation that includes sort of going over how the students will work with the counselor and sort of what the college process will mean for them each year. Having counselors work individually with students no later than 11th grade, so that when that the rubber hits the road in 12th grade, first semester, that there's already a relationship there. And also, I mentioned advisory. Sometimes, especially because in general, college counselors just have a really overload in terms of the ratio of students they're required to support. An advisor might be the best person to liaison with the family if that person knows the student best and sort of has more trust there. And there's different forms of distributive counseling that schools can try, and sort of using advisors to help be that kind of family liaison around college and career readiness is a promising practice, I guess. But, another thing I think is really important is communication and making sure that the counselor is on the same page with the student and the family. And so that's, again, where this idea of a post-secondary plan comes in. Again, there are things like College Board and Zello where you can create that plan online and adapt it each year, and it follows the students. I've seen schools use Google Docs to create post-secondary plans with students. And, there's no one right way to do it, but the idea is really sort of that a counselor and a student sort of can be literally on the same page because they have a shared document that they're looking at and referencing.
So some researchers have found that Latinx students are often pushed to attend less selective colleges than their academic records would predict, and that because these colleges may have fewer support systems, these students may actually end up dropping out at a higher rate than they would from a more selective school. How can this be addressed on a systemic basis?
Well, this is a huge question, and I'm certainly no expert in this area. I will say I'll mention two very promising practices that, in general work for all students, but I think can be really helpful to Latinx students and all students who, are underrepresented in higher ed. One is college bridge programs. Those are programs where after you graduate from high school, you enter a program that's like a bridge to college. And usually these programs feature near peer mentoring. So you actually have college students mentoring the recent high school graduates and sort of helping them prepare academically and social emotionally for what they're going to start to encounter when they get to college. And often it just helps with a lot of just sort of the logistics and paperwork of getting ready for college. So college bridge programs are really, I think, helpful, and I wish that was just sort of mandatory. And then there's also the educational opportunity programs, and the counselors that I've worked with since my days at New Vision have often called these the golden ticket for their students, because they provide both pretty intensive academic and financial support, but they also bring students into an institution as a cohort. So you kind of come in with a built-in sort of group of peers and friends, which is often really hard to develop in that first year. Just from a more national perspective, there's some really prominent organizations working on this that I think are doing a great job in trying to lead the way on improving outcomes for Latinx students. And one is Excelencia in Education. And I know they've collaborated with the U.S. Department of Education around something called Hispanic Serving Institutions, or SHIs. And these are institutions that tend to have 25% more of their students who identify as Latinx, but also have made it a very specific part of their mission to help Latinx students succeed. The Hispanic Federation does some really cool work around working with campuses in New York City, but all over the country, to provide students with peer mentorship. Again, that's just been a very promising practice in a lot of different areas, but also help students with career mentorships and internships. And then a big one is making sure they're connected and don't have interrupted services in the social service areas that they need. I can tell you one quick anecdote if you want about some work that I did in Miami.
Please, absolutely.
So Miami-Dade Community College is a Hispanic serving institution, HSI, and sort of like CUNY in New York City, they are the recipient of the majority of Miami-Dade's public school students, particularly those of color. And so I was part of an initiative there where they were working with the school district to really address what would become a major barrier for students, which was math. The students were coming into Miami-Dade Community College having to take remedial math and just, not being able to get out of remedial math. They actually sat down, looked at the data together, and saw a huge stumbling block. So they started to work together, and they actually brought in a couple of other local higher ed institutions to develop a math for college readiness course that could be taught the senior year of high school. And really, it wasn't necessarily very high level sophisticated math. It was kind of almost a refresher on all the basics that a student would need coming into college level math. You don't go into college level math and have to take what's a trigonometry. You need really solid basic mathematical facility. So they developed this course together as a way to both help high schools better prepare their students in math, but also to sort of smooth that entry for the students. And it really was powerful. And just a really great collaboration in terms of the high school math teachers and the college professors, like working together and listening to each other and understanding how each of their institutions or systems work and trying to come together around supporting student success.
Well, that's exciting, especially because institutions so often find it hard to collaborate, just structurally and otherwise.
Yeah.
Is that continuing as far as you know?
As far as I know, yes. And I think the idea also just has grown beyond Miami-Dade, just around acknowledging math as one of those major barrier areas and really trying to figure out, how to address that and work with across the two systems.
And I'm just curious, we interviewed Kate Bellin from Fannie Lou Hamer High School talking about the Algebra Project, and we're going to be talking with Bob Moses, who is the founder of it, of course. And I was just curious whether in any of your work, especially around math, you've worked with any schools or districts that have been using the Algebra Project, and if so, whether that's sort of helped with some of the stuff that you're talking about.
I have not personally worked with any that were doing the Algebra Project, but I know even in New York City, they have part of the mayor's excellence and equity agenda is algebra for all. So the goal is to have all 8th grade students in New York City passing at least an intro to algebra type course, so it doesn't become a barrier. I mean, it really, what happens between 8th and 9th grade is a mirror of then what happens for graduating seniors entering first year college. Math is also a barrier at the 8th grade, 9th grade level as well. But I've heard wonderful things about the Algebra Project. And I know it's a long-standing program that has been around. When a program survives, it usually is a testament to it's making a difference.
That's a good point.
There's been a lot of discussion recently about whether college for all is actually a desirable goal. Can and should fit and match be applied to situations in which students are not interested in college?
Yes, this is such a wonderful question. I mean, really, it's inherent to fit and match that college is not for all. That fit and match is about finding out what is the right post-secondary option for students. And that may be college and it may not be college. I think it's interesting that in a lot of cities, including New York City, the office that they have looking at this work are, here it's called the Office of Post-Secondary Readiness. I mean, just in naming it that, there's an acknowledgement that we're not just talking about college. And, I tend to think of post-secondary education in a very broad sense, 2 or 4 year colleges, specialized technical schools, apprenticeships, certificate programs, AmeriCorps type programs such as City Year, and also, of course, the military. But I do think the match and fit, in some ways, it just was the concept was sort of made to recognize the idea that college is not necessary for all students, as you said, at least immediately after high school. I think that, one scary statistic, though, for a lot of people working in high schools is that there is research that shows that students who go to college directly, the semester directly after graduating from high school, tend to do better than students who take time off. So that's something to wrestle with. But I will give you, I do think a lot more training is needed for schools to be able to advise students on these not, college alternative pathways. More experts are needed to really kind of understand how best to help families and students consider these different options, because there's high stakes in making that decision. And I'll give you, a positive example in New York City. There's an organization called Goddard Riverside Center, and they have something called the Options Institute, and they've been partnering for a long time with the New York City Department of Education, particularly the Office of Postsecondary Readiness, and they basically are responsible for training all of the Department of Ed counselors, college counselors in the city. But this year, they're now offering another training around educational and work-related alternatives to college. So I think, there's just growing acknowledgement that we're not serving our students well by taking the college access for all literally. It's really access to post-secondary for all.
So how does career and technical education, CTE, fit into these discussions? And how is today's CTE different from the older vocational education programs?
Yeah, so CTE is different from the older vocational programs in a couple of really key ways. One is that they are intended to be as academically rigorous as any other school's program. So they're not aimed at students who are sort of considered non-academic students. And in a lot of cases, they do have very rigorous academic components. Also, I think this is a really great thing, is that they all, regardless of what career or technical area the school is focused on, they all are required to teach a year-long course called Career and Financial Management. And so that's a course where students are really learning about the concept of career pathways. And that career pathways don't have to be linear. In fact, they often are not. It can include a total career change. The concept around career pathways is that everyone has agency to determine their career pathways. And then the financial management piece, I think, is really important too, because it gets into a lot of sort of financial literacy. So it's really about helping students sort of have some of the skills they'll need going forward, regardless of whether they go to college or career. I mean, I just think it's one of those things where I think in the past, this is the other point I was going to make, is that there's really a commitment at these schools, especially the ones I've talked to not counseling students directly into a career pipeline. That's just an option. And in fact, a lot of the counselors and teachers I've talked to at CTE schools say that students are kind of realizing by being at the school for 4 years that they don't want to go into this career area at all. And that's obviously, an invaluable realization. And I think some of us have had that situation where you do a job and you're like, oh my God, this is not what I thought it was, and I don't want to do this. So the point of CTE high schools, as opposed to both ed schools, I think, is it does not seal your fate, but it just gets you started on having an informed and intentional journey that has realistic parameters.
A recent guest, Carla Shedd, talks about the carceral continuum, the way institutionalized racism pushes low-income youth of color towards jail or early death from very early ages, especially in cities like New York, where systems of school choice that can determine children's entire lives can start as early as elementary school. What can counselors do to interrupt and disrupt the carceral continuum?
So this is such a big area as well, and I'm not an expert in this area at all. But I to tie it into sort of the theme of this podcast around match and fit, I think that it's actually sort of points even more to the need for, hopefully, for counselors to sort of advocate for match and fit as early as elementary school. And so parent coordinators are positions in every single New York City public school. It's a full-time position. And they, especially in elementary school, can play a really important role in helping families figure out sort of what are the best educational transitions for their child, particularly from elementary to middle school. There's lots of students who will do fine at any middle school, and then there's a lot of students who will only sort of thrive in a more particular kind of situation. And parent coordinators, a main part of their job in elementary school is to sort of lead parents through that process and connect them with other parents who have students at various schools. So I think that's something that is a really important part of it. There's also something called Inside Schools. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Yeah. And that's just a really amazing tool. It's online, it's free, and it allows parents to look at school profiles, that very accessibly written. It gives them some statistics on the schools in terms of achievement levels, but it also just sort of gives an overall idea of sort of what the school is like. It allows for people who have attended the school or know something about the school to comment on it. And it also just recently added a high school matching tool, which is not super sophisticated, but it does help you sort of winnow down, like, do you want to stay in a certain borough? Do you want a career and technical education school? It helps you sort of put in some filters to sort of try to make sense of the sort of huge, overwhelming number of choices. So from a bigger perspective, I mean, I think it's been exciting. New York City, I was just talking about this the other day. It's just shocking that it's the most segregated school system in the country. It's just that's a stone cold fact, and it's just crazy, right? So, but I do think there's some promising practices around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and some of them are being piloted in District 1, District 3, and District 15, not without controversy, but there is, it's an acknowledgement that, especially in the middle schools, certain middle schools are really been taken over by white, more affluent people, whereas certain schools have then become dumping grounds for lower income students, and that's not what middle school choice was intended to bring about. So it's kind of taking middle school choice and putting some parameters on it so that schools get a more balanced group of students. And so I think, I don't know if it's going to work, but I think it's something to be aware of and to think about and hopefully advocate for. I will also say that New York City has a lot of free after-school programs, and I feel like those go a little bit unsung or unnoticed. But basically, in New York City, for elementary and middle school years, you can have free after-school for your child's entire time in elementary and middle school. Now, that being said, there is an issue of quality consistency with some of these after-school programs. And that's definitely something I'm aware that the city is trying to address as a high priority. If you want, I can give you an example of that regarding the Summer Youth Employment Program, which is...
Sure, please.
So Summer Youth Employment Program has been around, I think, since the 50s. And
that's long.
Yeah,
wow.
It's been around a long time, and it really kind of grew. There's been a lot of support for it, but the way it grew was without much quality control. And only about 2 years ago, what was happening was it was a lottery system. So a student just was randomly assigned a summer youth employment opportunity. It didn't matter what they were interested in. It didn't necessarily matter where they lived. None of those fit and match things came into it. And so the city has been working with the Department of Ed and a lot of the providers that are involved with this work on doing something called school-based SYEP. And the idea is that the schools get involved with helping students to apply and make choices about what kind of employment opportunities, summer employment opportunities they want and would be a good fit for them. And then the schools also host some initial kind of trainings for students before they go off to their summer youth employment around, just getting used to the work environment, some of those soft skills that employers say are, gravely missing from their incoming employees, like communication, initiative, time management, those things. So, they're taking that and really trying to continue to serve as many students as they can, but address some of the quality issues. And I think that's a really promising direction.
Yeah, I definitely think that the more intentionality there can be for students in programs like, Summer Youth Employment Program, and the more that DYCD, the Department of Youth and Community Development, can support after-school programs and, provide professional development. We do some professional development for some of the after-school programs, and, staff members who are just incredible, but come without a whole lot of formal training. And a lot of times the training that they get is just real basic kind of stuff.
Totally.
So, and of course you're also talking about doing it in a part-time situation and so on, but it's a critical area because after school and out of school time can be so incredibly, valuable.
Especially for students who are at risk of incarceration or, that have things in there that, they need these extra sort of safe spaces, positive spaces for them to be able to access. So I think it's a really, really important area that, I think people overlook it a lot.
Yeah. And also, I just wanted to add to your shout out to Inside Schools, which I think the website's insideschools.org.
Yeah.
I might be wrong on that.
No, you're right.
But I think it's really valuable because one of the nice things about it is that it's not an official Department of Ed website, so that people can actually give their individual impressions. It's not like somehow having pressure that you've got to, with the best of intentions, be following kind of a party line on a school. So
they're very frank, and they divide every profile, I think, into the upside and the downside. So they definitely want to make the school is doing well, and then the things that the school may not be doing so well.
So going back to, you just made reference to sort of inevitably, or maybe not inevitably, but in a lot of cases, there end up being schools that are dumping grounds, in quotes.
Yeah.
So obviously helping, for the individual counselor working with the individual student, their job is to help that student get the best match and fit that they possibly can. But if there are fundamentally still insufficient numbers of, quotes, good middle schools or high schools, this is a larger question than counselors, but what role Do you see counselors, since they're, right, doing it on the front line, if you will, and also other professionals? What can counselors, is there an ethical obligation, basically, for all professionals dealing with schools to be adding to the pressure, both to integrate the schools and that there should not be any bad schools? That, I worked for Tony Alvarado in District 2 years ago, and he was a supporter of school choice, but his argument was that parents or students should be able to choose based on sort of the kind of classrooms that they wanted to be in, not whether they wanted to be in a good classroom or a bad classroom.
Right.
That all schools should be good. And then if you prefer sort of a first name basis with your teachers, that's one thing.
Right.
If you prefer, a more strict and formal situation, that's another thing. But it shouldn't be like, am I going to learn to read, or am I going to learn to do math? So what do you see as kind of the civic obligation that comes with all of this for counselors and teachers and principals and everybody else?
Well, I will say that I think all New Yorkers have an ethical obligation to advocate for a system of good schools. For our students in our public talent pipeline, because that's what the New York City public school system is, it's a public talent pipeline. If our students are successful, it benefits the entire city's economy and safety. I mean, there's just such a strong economic argument in addition to an ethical argument. So I do think it's something, so you could say I don't have kids in the school system, or I send my kids to private school or whatever, but you're still part of the city. And when students are not doing well in schools and going into their adulthood, having had the educational systems fail them, that is going to come back on the city in ways that are very costly and painful. So I just think it's sort of, a universal obligation for all New Yorkers. I mean, counselors and educators, they have some of the hardest jobs in the world, literally. And they work so hard, and I know it's hard for them to fit in yet just another, even anything into their lives, in addition to sort of having to become sort of out there, leading calls for change. But I do think by choosing to do the work in ways that they know are effective, for one, and speaking up when they're in situations where it's just untenable. So they have over 300 students to one counselor ratios, not just being complacent about that and saying, well, I'll just do the best I can, and some students will win and some will lose. That's the way it goes. Really trying to change that within their own schools, ask for help, advocate for things like advisory, distributive counseling. There's a ton of CBOs in this city that offer high quality college access and success programs that will partner with schools and that can be paid for through public funding. So I would just say not being complacent is an important thing for counselors and professionals to do, especially if they don't have other things that they can do in a more sort of citywide, like public way. At least sort of be focused on what they can do in the situation that they're in.
Some counselors may have strong ethical qualms about choices such as the military. Others may be influenced by organizations like 80,000 Hours, which urge young people to think about the societal impact of their career choices beyond just individual success or fulfillment. To what degree is it appropriate for counselors to raise these questions?
Yeah, no, I think this is a really great question. It sort of comes back to that tension question of what counselors are going to have to address certain things where there's no easy answers or there's no one right answer. So, I mean, from my perspective, I think it's important to provide the pros and cons of all options. I do think counselors, part of building trust with students and families is for counselors to talk from their own experiences. So if counselors can state their opinions and base them on facts or experiences in their own life or with previous students, I think that's important to share, all the while emphasizing that this is ultimately the student's journey, not theirs. I do think that it's naive, though, to think that counselors have the strongest sort of sway on students. In one of the focus groups I did last spring that I was mentioning with 11th grade public school students, the students said that they were really most influenced by older siblings, by peers and by favorite teachers. In some cases, because they just didn't have a lot of opportunities to meet with the counselor. So I think sort of knowing that students are going to get, different points of view from, and obviously from social media and from other places is important to take into account. So you are just providing another kind of source of information and advice. And I think, you have to be true to yourself as a counselor when, especially if you know a student well and they're considering an option that you think they should be aware of the different pros and cons.
So you mentioned, obviously, the tremendous caseload, if you will, that counselors have in New York City and in a lot of other cities, and rurally as well, I suspect. What would you say, including this or in addition to this, what do you think the biggest obstacles for counselors in, say, New York City are to do their jobs effectively? And are there things that our audience, for example, can do to try to help them overcome these obstacles?
That's a good question. I mean, not to be a broken record, I do think that the ratio of students to counselors is one of those universally acknowledged problems all over the country, frankly. And it's just one that doesn't seem to have political will around a solution. I'm working with an initiative called Career Ready NYC. It comes out of the Office for the Center for Youth Employment, And, in there's ideas being floated around, could there be career counselors that are shared among clusters of schools? For CTE schools, going back to them, in each CTE school, you have to have a work-based learning coordinator. And that person plays a very big role in sort of counseling students about what kinds of career options they're interested in, and then particularly what kind of work-based learning opportunities they want to do, and matching them with internships and things like that. And those work-based learning coordinators are, for some strange reason, required also to be a classroom teacher. So they are juggling just an impossible load. And in some cases, CTE schools will sometimes form sort of a council, and that they bring employers onto to sort of lighten the load of a work-based learning coordinator having to find employers who are willing to take students, or they try to set up agreements with larger institutions, for example, a hospital, so that they don't have to go to multiple places to find places for students to do job shadows or get a career mentor, things like that. But addressing that problem of the overload of work-based learning counselors in CTE schools is really important, and that's something that this Career Ready NYC initiative is looking to advocate for. So I think that, again, it's just each student has a unique path that they're going to follow, and students that are coming from low-income communities need sometimes more supports and more services to make their pathways viable. And so, I guess it's just you need more adults who can advise and counsel students in those ways. I do think that, again, I mean, it might not feel very, impactful, but I do find, as a parent myself of students in the public school system, elementary and middle right now, that I try to ask questions. Why don't we have this? Why don't we do this? If I see something that I feel like is really being overlooked, it doesn't always lead to change, or you don't always get the answer that you want, but at least asking questions. Again, you can often, a good advocate can sometimes be the parent coordinator in your school. It also can be something that you can raise to the PTA or the PA level. And, even if you don't have time to be part of a PTA or a PA, those are bodies that sometimes can advocate and push for things that, is powerful because it's coming from parents. But I do think, frankly, more money in the school system. Sometimes people say money doesn't matter, but it does matter. It definitely matters. It matters to bring down the size of classrooms, and it matters for technology, and it matters for ratio of adults to students in these more specialized roles.
Thank you so much, Abeel.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us. Check out our website for episodes and blogs, or contact us at hosts@ethicalschools.org. We've begun to post annotated transcripts of our interviews, and we offer professional development on social emotional learning and ethics in the New York City area. And we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And our editor and social media manager is Amanda Denti. Till next week.